Hey YouTube, Dawson Writer here, and welcome to my double review of Kikai Sentai Zenkaiger episode 20 and the special episode of Kamen Rider Saber, which actually comes first. So this is kind of a two-part crossover event between the two series that's meant to be sort of a tee-up for the movie, but it's pretty minor in terms of that. The only thing it does to tee it up is to obviously try to get people to go to the theaters to see it, and then like at the very end it sort of gives this teaser into the movie. But the plot itself doesn't have a whole lot to do with what's going on in the movie. I mean, as far as I know, I haven't seen the movie, so for all I know, stuff from this episode is going to be integral to it. But by that, I just mean that you're not going to be lost or anything like that, and it's not too entrenched in anything weird. It's kind of, even if anything in this episode has to do with the movie, it's standalone so you can enjoy it. The only thing really weird about it is for Saber, because where we're off in Zenkaiger, even though we're in the middle of debuting the new power-up forms and stuff, it's at an okay enough place to have this take place. I just said the word place a lot. But as far as Saber goes, we're like in the endgame arc, and we just had a huge thing with the big bad at the end, and so this is really awkwardly placed, and it stops the story cold. And that always bothers me. They've done this a few times before, and I think it's smart marketing, but again, it just also bothers me because it ruins the momentum, usually of the writer show. I think it kind of took some momentum out of a Guy Mark once and one other one. But anyway, so in the Saber one, you have Toma trying to think of an idea for a new novel when they see a shooting star, which is, I believe, Tukaiser's ship, and then Toji Dento shows up, and his power is to, like, cause discourse between couples, seemingly at first, but it's really just he alters people's perceptions for, like, wishes or something, which has to do with what we find out later. But they fight him, and it's worth noting that it's the first time we see these riders' base forms in a long time, especially Saber. It's been a long time since Saber's used his base form. And then Gokai Gold. Wow. That wasn't even a mistake. I mean, like, that wasn't even on purpose. That was a legit mistake. Then Tukaiser shows up, and it turns out he's been hopping worlds because he's been following this monster, and that's why he showed up here. And he's kind of talking to the writers about it, and they're comparing notes, and he describes who he is and all that good stuff. Telling him that he's a pirate, and Toma gets inspired by it to write a story, and he's talking about, like, oh, a story about how our precious treasure gets taken away. And then right after that, their ride books disappear, and they immediately think it's Zox, who is being attacked by the incest siblings, and they think it's him, but it turns out it was Toma. Because of the monster's power, it disappears their books when he writes it down. So then they go look for the monster, and since Tukaiser's the only one that can transform, they kind of watch him transform, and there's several call-outs to, like, some of the Sentai tropes in the dancing. They're like, why is he dancing? I'm like, I know exactly, I hate it. But it made for at least a funny scene, and then they kind of clap afterwards, which I found to be kind of amusing. They're trying to figure out how the monster's powers work, and it turns out it has something to do with this legend of Tsuruhime, which I believe, unless I'm misremembering this, was one of the forms they used for Ghost, because it instantly sounded familiar to me. But it had something to do with, like, her storyline, and they kind of do a flashback about that using the actors from Saber. And then they kind of discover that it's not truly granting wishes, but it's just altering people's perceptions. So when they're fighting the monster at the end of the episode of this carnival, they're like, they're actually right here, but we can't see him because the monster affected us. But May can see them, so May, like, puts the books in for them and they transform, and this time they use their power-up modes, and then we get the big together fight of everybody, of them fighting alongside each other, and they destroy the monster, but his, like, gear didn't explode. They're like, oh, that must be because of this world. I'm like, actually, it's because you're going to use him in the next episode. And then when he leaves, I think they also need to mention that they did another scene where Tukaiser danced, and Rentaro was like, is the dancing really necessary? They bring it up multiple times, which is funny. But anyway, at the end of the episode, Toma gives Tukaiser one of his books, and then he's getting ready to leave, but he's still being watched by the incest siblings who are, like, suspicious of him until he leaves the world. And he ends up pickpocketing them, which is why they hitch a ride with him back to the Zenkaiger's world. And that's when we get to the Zenkaiger's episode, and you pick up with the Zenkaigers getting ready to celebrate, and then when they're on their way out, they run into Tukaiser, who is fighting the two siblings, and then they run into the monster, who they all start fighting, and then he disappears. He disappeared Majin, who ran off earlier, and then he also disappears, what's his name, Kamen Rider Dirndl's sister. I always forget their names, but he disappears. His name's Ryuga, I think. This was legit the first episode I learned his real name, because there's just so many characters in Saber. But anyway, he disappears his sister. So you sort of have him working with the Zenkaigers to get his sister back, and Tukaiser still has his ride book. He does not have Sabella's ride book, but he has his ride book. And he's trying to convince Tukaiser to give him the ride book back, but he doesn't want to. But there is kind of a nice beat where they relate Sabella and his relationship to Two Kaiser's relationship with his sister, and like Two Kaiser goes and finishes. He goes in. That's for the Saber siblings, but he goes and visits his sister and sort of thanks her for all the help she's done for the whole series, you know, with the gears and just helping all the time. And it's kind of a nice moment, and I thought that was actually, like I said, kind of a nice beat that they drew this parallel between Two Kaiser and his sister and Sabella and her brother. And oddly enough, in terms of just doing that, and then a little bit of the discussions that he has with the Zenkaigers, was the most, I feel like, character moments we've really gotten out of those two in the whole series. And then this wasn't even in their series. This was technically in the Zenkaiger part. Like, it wasn't anything revolutionary, but I feel it was one of the only times they've actually touched on their character and bond, because on the show, he just was basically about like, oh, duty to Logos, and then now we're gonna help you because Logos has gone corrupt, and she's just been like, I'm evil and I'm gonna get Toma out of the sword, and then she's like, oh, I'm in love with my brother. And so they haven't gotten very much, I guess, and this was like the most stuff that I felt actually made them feel like real characters, and it was in the crossover, oddly enough. So they basically come up with this plan to disguise themselves as potential kidnap victims, because they discover that also has to tie in with the Legend of Tsuruhime, and the monster's taking girls with ponytails, and they're candidates for this, because we see that Majin and Sabella have been taken back to this place with all these other girls, and basically the villains just wanted to kidnap his sister, Two Kaiser's sister. They didn't have any interest in the plot. The monster is the one that wants Tsuruhime substitutes. So that was kind of funny. Their plan sort of ends up working when the monster shows up and we get our big fight together. And there's another funny beat. That was one of the funny things about this crossover, is them drawing attention to the tropes, like I mentioned, with them wondering why the dancing was happening. And then in this one, the Zenkaigers roll call and pose, and they're like, yo, Kamen Rider guy, why aren't you roll calling and posing? Which I think was funny. And then so he does a roll call and pose. It's worth mentioning the Two Kaiser showed up and actually gave him his Wonder Ride book after he had that talk with his sister, which was a nice moment. And then Sabella and Majin show up, and they show a flashback to how they broke out, and they get their sort of team-up fight. It was kind of cool to pair them together. I mean, not only just because they're the two females in the crossover, but their powers are both kind of illusion-based, so I thought that was kind of a smart beat as well. Almost forgot to mention, they also had a part where they used gears that Flint made that are based off of Kamen Rider that she gave him during that nice scene with Two Kaiser, and he gives them to the Zenkaigers, or the Zenkaigers, I always did, no, I got it right the first time, Zenkaigers. He gives them to the Zenkaigers, and they use a Saber, Zero One, and Geo powers, which, you know, it's a harmless little crossover scene. The funniest part, though, for me, was that Vroom was then like, why didn't I get one? And I was like, yeah, couldn't they have given him, like, build or something? I guess they might not have made it for whatever promotion they're selling, but it did seem kind of funny. And then amongst all that, I almost forgot, with all the stuff going on with the team-up stuff, we're debuting Two Kaiser's Super Two Kaiser form, because last week we did the Zenkaiger one. So he debuts that. It felt a little bit shoehorned in. I was slightly bothered by it, just because it feels weird to debut that in the middle of this crossover episode, but I guess we didn't need a whole to-do about it. You know, we got the story last week for the device itself, and we already set up that he made a copy. And then next week we're going to do a story about the mecha. So it's not a huge deal. It did just feel weird and a little bit shoehorned in. And as far as the form itself, it's okay. Like, it was a cool debut. I think that even though it's a lot more cumbersome and kind of loud, I think Zenkaiser's is a lot cooler. This one seems a little bit more boring to me. But you get him teaming up with Ocean Master Guy, and they take out the monster. We get the Monster of the Week fight. There was also another call out to them wondering why Two Kaiser is dancing, because he gets a new dance for the Henshin sequence for the super mode, which feels a little bit more hip-hoppy, which was kind of funny. And then at the end you have this nice moment where Sabella hugs Majin, and then they send him off. And then the teaser for the crossover is basically when they get back to Saber's dimension, they just awaken this guy. So like I said, the plot itself involving this monster had very little to do with sort of intriguing you for the team up. I think it was just that last teaser that's going to do it. It remains to be seen. Like, the movie could have something to do with what went on in this, but it felt very bare bones. But I think that was kind of good. Not that it was bare bones, but I mean, I think it was good that the plot itself was self-contained, so you didn't feel like you had to see the movie and you don't feel too lost amongst it. So I think that was a good thing. And so overall, I thought this was fine. It was pretty harmless. It wasn't my favorite thing ever, but it wasn't the worst. My only real problem with it was just that it stopped Saber's story cold. But I found it to be mostly enjoyable. You know, there were some funny interactions. The plot was decent enough for it. It didn't feel too convoluted. The fact that Zenkaiger is playing by multiverse rules made that also a lot less confusing, because one of the things that I get very annoyed at in these Sentai and Rider crossovers is the fast and loose rules, where one minute they're all in the same universe and the next minute they're in different universes. And I feel there was just no confusion about that. It was fairly straightforward. They came up with a plot that held the whole thing together pretty decently. I thought there wasn't a whole lot of like emotional beats in the first part, but the second part I thought had some nice sort of character parallels between the Saber characters and the Zenkaiger characters, namely Tukaiser and his sister, and so I thought that was kind of nice, and they did a good job of sort of tying in some of the themes of Saber and stories and stuff like that in the first one, and there were some cool fight scenes, and like I said, I did really enjoy the moments, the comedic moments that sort of called out the quirks of each series, like them drawing attention to his dancing and clapping over it, and drawing attention to the fact that Kamen Riders don't really have roll calls, and I thought that it was fun and it was harmless. I would say it was solid. It was a solid 3 out of 5. You know, I enjoyed myself. If it were up to me, I still wouldn't do it because, again, it just kind of interrupts things for me, but I think it's a smart marketing move. And I did like when they used to do this for some of the Kamen Rider movies. Like, I remember the first one that I remember seeing them do this was Den-O, where the movie story tied into the series, and I thought that was kind of cool. But I don't like it as much when it's tying into a crossover movie, but I understand why they do it. But what did you guys think of the 2-part crossover? Let me know in the comments as always. Until next time, like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell so you can see my videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.